I'm Western Bragg, and this is Second Estate, a podcast where myself and guests will talk about politics, society, religion, philosophy, and culture from a counter-revolutionary, traditionalist perspective. Thanks for listening. Hello, and welcome to Second Estate. So, last episode I said that most likely this episode would be about the future of morality, but for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that I want to do a guest on the next episode, and I'm not yet sure how exactly we're going to do that. And second, because I have a few questions that were asked me about what the true right is, and since that's so integral to this podcast, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So, that's just my quick note, and without further ado, we'll get into it. Most people today have an idea of the left-right dichotomy. They have a very strange notion of how it works. So to most people, someone who is center-right would be someone like Emmanuel Macron, who is virtually silent about social issues while being economically pro-market. However, if someone is called far-right or a right-wing extremist, they often are anti-market and care only about social issues. So why? The problem with our modern way of thinking about politics lies with a concept called the Overton window. The Overton window, named for political scientist Joseph Overton, is basically the range of ideas that are acceptable in public discourse. Things in the middle of the window make policy and are popular, but as you head towards the fringes, things become simply acceptable, followed by radical and finally unthinkable. This is why Julius Evola, a radical even for his time, noted that, quote, "My principles are only those that, before the French Revolution, every well-born person considered sane and normal," end quote. Today, we hear everyone from politogrammers to major politicians referring to themselves as classical liberals, and nearly all of them are considered by modern standards to be right-wing. Since liberals seek to reinvent and conservatives seek to preserve, what then is classical conservatism, the opposing force to classical liberalism? As we delve into the topic, it will be clear that the right wing of today is far removed from the right wing of the past, and not only does it negatively affect our way of thinking about political theory, it also prevents ideas of the true right from taking hold. The problems can be traced back primarily to a massive shift in the Overton window to the left. Classical conservatism, or traditionalist conservatism, could be considered the guiding ideology of the European Middle Ages. It was most represented amongst the aristocracy, monarchies, and the church. However, with the rise of ultra-rich commoners as merchants, the rise of capitalism, the first and second industrial revolutions, and the Enlightenment, as well as its political revolutions, led to the destruction of the aristocracy. With it, the primary supporters of the right wing were gone. With Western civilization transitioned into democratic governments, the relative few of the aristocracy and the clergy were no longer represented to the same degree, and the left was able to achieve absolute supremacy over the governmental systems. This new order couldn't last for long. The left is by definition in favor of revolution, so a new left formed against the world created by the classical liberals. These communists, anarchists, and progressives formed the basis of what we now know as the left. What was originally considered to be far left became the left, and the center-left classical liberals became the right. You can see how this would confuse anyone attempting to spectrumize the political left and right, but it gets even more convoluted. In post-Great War Europe, fascism arose, and attempted a reaction to both new left and old left. This right-wing ideology was dubbed third positionism, when it in fact was not a third position, but rather a classical conservative ideology colored with extreme nationalism and militancy. Though today fascism is overshadowed by Adolf Hitler's extreme racial theories, it was rooted in tradition, culture, community, and hierarchy, the same ideals of the classical right wing. This can best be exemplified in Francisco Franco's Spain. Franco, who was himself a monarchist and counter-revolutionary, is the perfect example of a pre-modern conservative's influence on fascism. Fascism and other reactionary ideologies presented a new problem for the left-right dichotomy. Some considered the fascists beyond left and right, while others considered them to be far-right. The general consensus today seems to be that they were far-right, but this causes a problem, since the classical liberals have been falsely attributed as a right-wing ideology. When one looks at Emmanuel Macron or a Paul Ryan, it should be that a center-right individual is like a far-right individual, but to a lesser degree. But in what world is an amplified Macron Mussolini? I believe that one of the biggest problems with modern political understanding of the left and right is that we have placed far too much importance on economic policy. While the classical liberals were staunchly pro-market and the new left is anti-market, the classical right wing, as well as newer movements like fascism, see the market as a means to an end, not an end of itself. While a leftist might say that the purpose of the market is to allocate goods to those who need them most, and a classical liberal might be interested in achieving peak efficiency, the classical right is unconcerned by the market. To the fascists, the market must obey the state, and never the other way around. To the pre-modern right, it is almost below their concern. Both fascist and classical conservative ideologies are very different in that they are unconcerned with the material. Classical conservatives are concerned about things like transcendent moral virtue. When faced with ideologies concerned more with the transcendent than the material, a classical liberal or leftist is often unable to correctly place them on a scale that measures primarily economic policy. I myself identify economically as a distributist. On the surface, this may appear to be a leftist economic stance. It advocates that wealth be widely owned rather than concentrated. However, once one gets into the reasons behind distributism, it becomes less clear. While the left views economic equality as a goal, distributism sees it as a good way to create a virtuous people. Rather than being concerned with class struggle, distributism wants to prevent it. Distributism is rooted in ideology not of the left, but of the classical right: tradition, community, family, and transcendent moral virtue. I would argue that distributism is a fundamentally right-wing ideology, but because the right is now synonymous with the originally left-wing bourgeois capitalism, this is lost on most people. It is baffling that an ideology supported by the Roman Catholic Church and folks like G.K. Chesterton could be considered more left-wing than one espoused by Hillary Clinton and the like. Therein lies the greatest difficulty of holding my political and philosophical views in the modern era. While the majority of my views would not be considered extremist, they are so far removed from the modern Overton window that they may appear outlandish. Even people like Tucker Carlson have been described as being against conservatism, while simultaneously being considered far-right. For example, earlier this year, there was a New York Times opinion piece titled "Tucker Carlson versus Conservatism," in which Tucker was described by supposed conservatives as being a, quote, conspiratorial socialist, and attacked for, quote, ignoring capitalism's fruits. Interestingly, Tucker's disdain for bourgeois capitalism does not make him less right-wing. It makes him more right-wing. His concern for the traditional family over profit means he's the closest to the classical right wing that we have in modern mainstream America. So where does this leave us? Well, first, people like Tucker Carlson, and I dare say even Donald Trump, are a step in the right direction. The opposition of right-wing individuals to leftism, new and old, means that our Overton window is broadening. As people begin to lose faith in our hyper-consumerist, neoliberal modern state, they're searching for alternative solutions. If those on the side of the classical right want to be relevant in modern politics, we must channel our beliefs through those channels already available to us. If we make our voices as loud as possible and receive backlash from the left, we may be able to receive positive coverage from folks like Tucker. However, we must also be careful not to stray too far from the Overton window. Perhaps you think that feudalism would be the perfect way to organize a society. I too understand the urges of that system, but it would not be productive to start an American feudal party and advocate a literal return to serfdom. To say that we should have a monarchy in America, completely abolish separation of church and state, or begin imperializing other countries would be nothing but unwise. The Overton window does not move overnight unless some catastrophic event occurs. If we hope to become relevant in today's political discourse, slow, steady growth is the most reliable, though perhaps not the only way to do so. So I still haven't exactly answered the question of what exactly the classical right is. In my view, the classical right wing is best epitomized by 5 main tenets: respect and reverence for capital T tradition, hierarchy rather than egalitarianism in government, being relatively unconcerned about the market, and almost always being rooted in religion. In this case, for the Western European classical right, being Christianity, more explicitly Catholicism. This is not to say, however, that a Protestant or Orthodox is barred from being a classical conservative. Even a person of secular beliefs could be considered classically right-wing, but they most likely would at least recognize the utility of religion for creating a content and virtuous populace. This has been the first true episode of Second Estate, and I hope it gave you a better idea of what I mean when I say the true right. Next week, I'm going to try to have on my first guest to talk about the future of morality in what seems to be an increasingly immoral world. In the face of consistently growing secularization, how will people derive their morality, or will we descend into chaos? I'm very much looking forward to next week's episode, and I hope that you are as well. I hope that so far you've been able to get a bit of a feel for the podcast, and if you liked it, be sure to support by following me on SoundCloud and telling your friends. If you have any more questions you'd like to hear answered on the next episode, don't hesitate to reach out to me on Instagram at western.prag. As always, thanks for listening.